I'm the director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture, and we are excited to have a two-day workshop looking at neuroscience in the wild, exploring those issues. I just want to talk a little bit about the center. Our mission is to promote and foster interdisciplinary research at the intersection of mind, brain, and culture. The center does a variety of different types of programming like this workshop, lunches, colloquia, and other kinds of sort of some funding as well. So I'd just like to, pick up a card and definitely check out what our programming is going to be in the next semesters, as well as if you're interested in these kinds of issues, we have an affiliate program, so you just click and become an affiliate and you get emails telling you about our programming as well as programming related to mind, brain, and culture across the university and the college. So Dietz Stout, our associate director, is going to do the introduction, so I'll hand it over to Dietz.
Great. Thank you, Lynn, and welcome everybody to our CMBC and Neuroscience Initiative workshop on neuroscience in the wild. So this title, I think I like it. It's a catchy phrase. I did a quick search to see. It's we're not the first ones to use it. It's popping up particularly in recent years, especially for kind of public science outreach type events. Something really cool going on in London I saw. Most approximately, I probably picked it up from my colleague Aldo Faisal, who uses it to describe the work he does with naturalistic full-body motion capture and mobile brain imaging. But what it makes me think of is a book from 1995 by Ed Hutchins called Cognition in the Wild, which is probably one of the early contributions to what we now call 4E cognition, which I always miss one: embodied, embedded, inactive, and extended cognition. So in this book, he is an anthropologist, but also a open ocean racing sailor, and he used the example of merchant marine navigation to argue that human cognition is really a holistic product of interacting systems of people, places, and objects. And in order to understand it without engaging in some dangerous and potentially misleading reductionism, you need to actually study it in what he called its natural habitat, that is, out in the wild. But of course, the problem with doing this is it's really hard to do. That's not an easy task. And so I think what brings us here today is the excitement that potentially our methods are finally catching up with some of our ambitions in this regard. So that's really the emphasis today, to talk about how we're going to be able to study this. Another phrase that people use on this topic is real-world neuroscience. So I'll just provide you a quote from a really excellent recent review in the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. Many fundamental principles of brain organization, such as hierarchical processing or segregation, have been established by research utilizing well-controlled but simplified paradigms with basic artificial stimuli. In contrast, real-world situations, which most experiments intend to model, are typically dynamic, complex, multisensory in nature, and as such rely heavily on a variety of top-down, attentional and otherwise mechanisms for us to be able to function effectively in everyday life, drive a car, remember our shopping list, and so forth. Recently, a number of approaches have been developed, largely independently from each other, that aim to bridge traditional neurocognitive paradigms and the demands posed by naturalistic environments. So now nobody that I'm really aware of is arguing that this is ever going to replace the controlled experimental methods that have gotten us this far in the first place. But what we're doing here today, I hope, is to explore what kind of new questions we can ask, the new insights that these might offer, and how exactly we're actually going to be able to do this. So that's the general motivation for the workshop. Our first speaker, Suzanne Dikker, as you may have noticed, is not physically here. Has had some unfortunate situations since she's been very generous to actually join us online to give her presentation. Suzanne Dikker is a research scientist affiliated with Utrecht University and New York University, And her research merges cognitive neuroscience, education, and performance art in an effort to understand the brain basis of human social interaction. Together with media artist Matthias Oostrik and other collaborators from both the sciences and the arts, she uses portable EEG and a series of crowdsourcing neuroscience experiments, interactive brain installations that investigate the role of brainwave synchronization between two or more people in successful communication. These experiments are executed outside of traditional laboratory settings, such as in schools and museums. She will be talking to us today about brains in harmony, connecting art, neuroscience, and education outside the laboratory. And as she's a remote speaker, I'll just ask you to please hold any of your questions to the end, and then we'll possibly need to repeat them so that you'll be able to hear them, okay? So thank you, and Susanna, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a little ironic to, as I said earlier, to be giving a remote presentation arguing in favor of conducting neuroscience research during face-to-face interactions. I will also be showing you data that this kind of presentation might not be the most conducive way of recalling and processing information. So please bear with me on those. I've worked with many collaborators for some pictures I will see. This is a large effort, and it's funded by both artistic grants and scientific grants in a collaboration with multiple institutions. But Matthias Oostrik is my collaborator who's been holding my hand from the very start of this process. So I just wanted to put his face up there as, I don't know how large your screen is, but big, I guess, before starting. So as most of us interact with others face-to-face on a day-to-day basis, but we know very little about how the human brain supports dynamic social interactions, let alone outside of laboratory context, right? That's the theme of this workshop. And so what we have been doing is we've capitalized on a fairly recent development, now less and less recent, and more people are doing this, where instead of taking a stimulus brain approach in neuroscience research, people have been taking a brain-to-brain approach, which is essentially a methodological shift where you compare brain activity across people instead of averaging individual responses to stimuli. And that allows you to investigate naturalistic stimuli, and it also opens up the doors for conducting face-to-face neuroscience in what's called hyperscanning situations. So usually this field of research, people take some form of the overarching hypothesis that a successful interaction is correlated with an increase in synchronized brain activity across people, and that the opposite is true for an unsuccessful interaction. Now, synchrony, interaction, and success can mean various different things depending on the questions asked and the methodology that is used. For example, there's a lot of studies that conduct and do inter-subject correlations using fMRI. There was a very nice recent study, for example, showing that friends, like people who are closer to each other in the social networks, show more similar brain responses to videos than people that are farther removed from each other. But that obviously doesn't allow you to do research during real social interactions. It's a little inconvenient to use a euphemism, to drag MRI machines into a lecture hall like where you're sitting yourself. So what we did instead is we used portable EEG technology, and we developed software that allowed us to report from multiple people simultaneously, and that filtered the signals into different canonical EEG frequency bands, and then computes correlations online between the signals of the two people. Now, you can then use this information, these R values that come out of it, to create any kind of output. So in a brain-computer interface style. For example, we've created a simple neurofeedback game where people get 3 minutes to synchronize their brain waves as much as possible. So you can see how the heads merge in and out of each other, and the closer they get, the more the higher the R value, the closer the heads go together. And then every time it meets a certain threshold, the heads overlap completely and the score goes up. And then you can compare your score to people that went before you or after you, or you can try different conditions, like what if you look at each other or what if you look away. And so these kinds of experiments that give you an intuitive sense of synchrony have been proven very valuable as both an art outreach tool. We've used this at different museums, at the World Science Festival. And on the bottom left, you see a picture of an evening, a neurotango evening, where we had tango dancers dance with each other to music, dance without music, stand there in silence, just listen to music. And that inspired a discussion around coordination and synchrony in dance. In tango specifically, you have two individuals, but then they sense that they're becoming a third person together. So here it's used really as an inspiration for a discussion. But we also could then use these outreach opportunities to test the possibilities and limitations of using this technology in research, especially since the headsets that you're seeing, which are emotive headsets, were traditionally, they're used sometimes in research now, but they're traditionally considered toys, something to play games with. And so we really wanted to test whether we could use this for serious scientific purposes, so to say, and whether motion artifacts weren't too much of a problem in this case. So I'm going to talk to you about a number of projects, and starting with a few larger scale art projects and then moving into education and then back to art. So the first larger scale, more serious experiment that we conducted in the museum was measuring the magic of mutual gaze, which was in collaboration with performance artist Marina Abramovic. Maybe some of you have seen clips of this. In 2010, she was at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where she sat for 3 months straight, completely still. She herself wanted to sit day and night, but the museum didn't allow her to stay overnight. But during opening hours, she did not move at all. And then the audience could sit opposite her for as long as they pleased, and they did this from anywhere ranging between 2 minutes and 8 hours. Some people turned this into their own performance. But by the end of this, people lined up around the corner to sit with her. And I'm part of a group of researchers, psychiatrists, and artists, and we came together right after this meeting, and what resonated a lot, right after this, this exhibition with her, and what resonated a lot with everybody was the intense emotional reactions that this stirred in both the audience members and in the performance artist herself. Now there's one very mundane explanation, which is that if you try having eye contact with somebody for longer than a few seconds, you don't blink as often, so you start tearing up fairly easily. But there are also obviously very real emotional reasons why having prolonged eye contact with somebody can stir reactions, because biologically speaking, we're not supposed to engage in eye contact with each other for longer than a few seconds, or something has to happen, right? Punch each other in the face, kiss, laugh, run away, something, right? And this is pushing people in a position of social contact that makes you vulnerable, so to speak. In any event, so we decided to restage The Artist is Present as a neuroscience experiment to investigate the relationship between eye contact, brain synchrony, and the feeling of connectedness. And at the time, there was one other study that had done hyperscanning by Guillaume Dumas, where they studied joint action, but it was really at the infancy of this field. Now, obviously, there's much more research out there on this question as well. But we set up the museum as a laboratory, or maybe a stereotypical laboratory. The walls were painted an ugly green. Everybody was wearing lab coats. As obviously that's not true in real life for cognitive neuroscientists. And then the audience members could follow along as the experiment unfolded with the setup, watching people engage in eye contact for 30 minutes. And also the operator station, some squiggly lines, some like numbers that were hard to interpret, making it look extra sciencey. And then behind the two participants, there were two mesh rotating brains that reflected both which frequency was dominant at each moment in time, so faster pulsations or higher frequencies, and moments where the two brains, quote unquote, came together, so where synchrony met that threshold. So this is essentially the same thing as what I showed earlier with the two heads, but then a different visualization. And we found that, that when we compared pairs that were engaging with each other to random pairs, that there was an increase in synchrony in the alpha band and posterior electrodes, which is often associated with like idling together. So in the compatibility racer, we translated synchrony into the speed of a moving cart, which goes faster as synchrony increases and then slows down as it decreases. So here you see people conversing. This was in Berlin at a festival. And you see people trying, joint motion, joint action. I'll come back to this later in terms of the strategies that people try to come up with. And as you can imagine, it's fairly easy to get people to participate in these fun amusement rides where you can literally fuel a card with your brain synchrony. But it's very hard to get usable EEG signals. So people moving back and forth with their headset creates tons and tons of motion artifacts that renders the brain data uninterpretable. So in the mutual wave machine, we instead ask people to sit still as they are engaging with each other opposite each other. Like minimize movement as much as possible. So we allow people to talk to each other, but we make them aware of the fact that a lot of motion generates motion artifacts. And so here they're surrounded by a light that reflects the extent to which their brain activity is synchronized, where the ball shows it's a sphere, and it shows more light when there's more synchrony, and this light retracts when there's less synchrony. And here you see a video of the mutual wave machine in action, where you can also see that there is a real-time video that emerges from the noise, so to speak, as synchrony increases. And so you see yourself better if you're synchronizing more with the person opposite you. And this alludes to questions of what it really means to be in sync with somebody. Are you seeing the other person, or are you really projecting yourself on the other person? And is that what makes you feel a connection with others? So the mutual wave machine has been exhibited, well now actually more than 5,000 people have participated in it across North America and Europe and Moscow. And I'm going to show you some data from one museum where we collected a little over 1,000 participants. It's our most comprehensive data sets, or at least contaminated data set too. And here, half the people were told that explicitly that more synchrony was translated into more light, so that they can infer from what they saw how in sync their brains were in real time, and half of them were not given this information. And so this manipulation was possible because we had discovered over the years, doing these kinds of experiments and installations in museums, is that people go stand in line for things without knowing what they're getting into. So people can be standing in line for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then sit down and so what is this? What is this all about, right? So, and I know this from my own experience. I even go see a play without reading the playbill in advance or knowing what I'm getting into, and the same for museums, right? So we capitalized on this, I don't know if laziness is the word, but on this like willingness of people to like go into art experience uninformed, by not lying to people, but by telling half of the people over and over again what this was about, so that they at least knew, and then the other half may or may not, but they may just think that it has something to do with their brain. And so we thought that this would be a motivational manipulation. So even if so that people who were sitting there knowing that and thinking that there was some relationship between how well they connected and what they saw would be motivated to actually keep engaged with each other for the full 10 minutes that they were participating. So other factors that we tested were people's social closeness, personality traits, and their mental states. We asked for this information in questionnaires both before and after the experience. And then, as you can imagine, these were still less than suboptimal recording conditions, again, a euphemism. So we tried to like circumvent this or mitigate these conditions in two ways. So one is just attack it with sheer numbers. So with lots and lots of people, their patterns might emerge. And then secondly, and this is where my collaborator Yorgos Michalareas comes in, who's a signal processing expert, we computed synchrony in two different ways, imaginary coherence and projective power correlations, which both are metrics that take out the common noise or instantaneous correlations. So the theory being that any kind of noise in the environment would be taken out of the signal before you compute synchrony, and that allows you to get at like the meaningful synchrony that is not due to just stuff that comes in from electrical noise or even seeing the same thing and processing it simultaneously. All right, so we found that we measured social closeness with the inclusion of the other and self skill, which is a very simple and intuitive way of measuring social closeness. There's two circles, and you select which of the seven applies to you and your partner, and then we average it across for each partner across the two participants. And we found that this average social closeness was correlated with synchrony, where those pairs who reported higher social closeness also showed higher overall synchrony. When it comes to personality traits, we used the interpersonal reactivity index, which measures different kinds of empathy and perspective taking. And we found that pairs with lower personal distress showed higher overall synchrony, but we found no relationship with perspective taking, which is, I guess, more of a conscious, deliberate decision-making about helping others. So there's the emotional, I mean, this is possibly not the most careful interpretation of these metrics, but grossly speaking, you could consider personal distress being the more emotional version of interpersonal reactivity as opposed to perspective taking. And then we also looked at, for mental states of motivation, we looked at changes in synchrony over time, and we found that those pairs who remained more focused also showed more synchronized activity in the second half of the experience. So basically, if your focus stays up, then you are synchronizing more and more over time. And the same was true when it comes to motivation. So only that group of participants who had explicitly been told that there was a relationship between what they saw and brain synchrony showed this increase in synchrony over time. So it's possible that this indicates that that people, they start being distracted in terms of connectedness with each other over time, which also doesn't allow them to be as synchronized. So as I mentioned before, these installations and experiments are a very fruitful opportunity for education and outreach. And with the mutual wave machine, so specifically, there's also, the challenge of what kind of information you give people as they walk out of it, right? So people really want to know whether they should get married or divorced based on our installation or what they just experienced, but obviously we will have to tell them that that would be reverse inference, and we can't really give them that kind of information. And so we are now creating a public website where at least they get some information about the results that I just showed you, but in a little bit more digestible fashion. And another opportunity for outreach in these installations is that there's a lot of setup times. Well, there's about 10-minute setup time before people go into the mutual wave machine or participate in our experiments. And so this is an opportunity for us to give them a mini course, I guess, in neuroscience, and show them, the raw EEG signal, and then it becomes very intuitive that we're not dealing with like a mind reading device or anything, and that you need to do a lot of interpretation before those squiggly lines become meaningful, and that there's a lot of, that is problematic. And I think that for me personally, and for a lot of people, have been a very valuable, opportunity in conducting these experiments, because there's a lot of misunderstanding, as I'm sure you're aware, about what we can tell from our neuroscience findings. So we took this educational aspects to a larger scale, both in terms of the amount of people that we collect data from, and in terms of our, the length of the program of our educational outreach opportunities. So concretely, we went into the classroom and recorded brain data from groups of students as they interacted naturally. And so we started this line of group synchrony research in the classroom for multiple reasons. I'm not an educational scientist. I'm interested in learning, but I'm not an educational scientist. But the classroom does bear some similarities to the laboratory while still remaining naturalistic. So kids, for one, are being used to being told to sit still and shut up, which is very useful for the data quality. But they are also used to engaging in a set of predetermined activities that each may take a couple of minutes. Now you're going to read a book for a couple of minutes. Now you're going to watch this video. And there are not so many other, naturalistic interactions that operate like that, and that still allow us then for some experimental control, which the classroom then is an ideal situation to take this first step. So concretely, we paired up with now 3 high schools in New York City. And this is from Trevor High School on the Upper West Side. We started the school year with a crash course in neuroscience. So we basically took over an entire high school advanced biology class for the full school year, starting with the crash course in neuroscience, where kids learned how to use the equipment, as you just saw. And that was also very useful for us, because then they could help us design the experiment that they were then a part of later, which made them more involved and committed participants. And they could help us with the setup, because we only had 50 minutes time slots, and we needed to set up 12 people. So if the kids were trained at helping each other out, we could maximize the time that we were actually recording brain activity from them. And in terms of having committed research participants, everybody who's done experiments knows that this is important. People fall asleep during our experiments, unfortunately all the time. And in this case, we really found that it was important also for kids to engage them and to make them feel like they have ownership over the experiment. There's a large contrast between the first school where we did this program, and then after we finished the recording, we also allowed them to help them conduct their own research experiment and guided them through the entire process. And the second school, where we didn't have this full integrated program, and kids we asked them to look at the wall, and they started playing with their phone, or they fell asleep during the 1 or 2 people fell asleep during the recording. There was a large attrition. So just a reminder of something that we know, that it's important to involve the participants' motivation is very important. But in any event, so we have now been expanding this educational portion into a full fledged curriculum that we've been implementing in high risk or like low socioeconomic background schools in New York City. So the educational part is leading its own life completely. Back to the research. In the classroom, in the first school, we collected data from 12 students for 11 classes, so we came back 11 times. And in each class consisted of instruction activities, reading aloud from lecture notes, watching videos, lectures, and engaging in group discussion. And this was all teaching the material that they were going to be tested on later. And then some, sanity check baseline activities. And then we computed brain-to-brain synchrony during these class activities and correlated it with factors relating to classroom engagement and classroom social dynamics. So, for example, we asked kids how much they enjoyed each teaching style, and surprise, surprise, they didn't really care too much for the teacher just taking their lecture notes and reading out loud from them. In fact, we had to cancel after we only did this for 3 classes, and then had to get rid of that condition altogether because it wasn't conducive to their learning at all. But they did like engaging in group discussions, and they liked watching videos. And we also saw some patterns where this changed across the semester. But more interestingly and importantly for our purposes, we saw that this engagement correlated with brain synchrony. So here I'm just showing bar graphs, but there's a correlation between the two, where kids who reported higher engagement for particular classes and class activities also showed stronger synchrony with the rest of the group for those particular activities and that particular class. And we also found that student-to-group synchrony was predicted teacher likability. So students were more in sync with each other if they liked the teacher better. And in a second school, we replicated this for student-to-teacher synchrony. So here we see that kids are more synchronized with their teacher if they like the teacher better. We also saw that students who were more focused showed more synchrony with the rest of the group for that particular day. And then we saw that there were some social traits that predicted synchrony. So there is a groupiness trait, which is which asks questions like, an important part of my identity is to be a member of some group. So specifically, this doesn't ask any questions about the group that you're in, but like what your propensity is, your character of liking to be in a group setting. Like at any university, there are some kids who join the cheerleader team or wear apparel, and then there's other kids. There's other kids who prefer to be alone or at least not affiliate themselves with the group. And we found that this predicted synchrony fairly strongly, actually, in the classroom. And the same was true for the empathy measure that I showed you before, where there was a negative correlation between kids' personal distress and their synchrony with others. And so what is interesting and puzzling, perhaps, is that these data are from activities where they're not really interacting with each other directly. So kind of like what you are doing right now, you're sitting in a room with other people, but you're watching me and listening to me. So during this activity of lecture or video watching, we saw that kids' brains were more strongly correlated with each other if they were more social people. And that raises a lot of questions about what this means in terms of, is this a resonance thing? Is this an attention thing? Are your social traits actually predicting how you perceive input? And those are kinds of questions that we are now taking back into the lab to address. But there's like some small answer in peer-to-peer synchrony findings that were that we found. Sorry, findings that we found. Where we here capitalized on the fact that you are in a social setting. So each class the setup was U-shaped, and we randomized where kids sat. So they walked into class, they went to the seat where their number, their EEG headset number was. They set each other up, and then they were asked before the class started to turn around and look at each other face to face for 2 minutes. Now we're dealing with high schoolers, so the first couple of recordings of this were, I don't want to say a disaster, but obviously there wasn't like just straight up eye contact. There was a lot of giggling. You know, maybe we had set people opposite each other that had crushes on each other. I don't know. Like it was a very, going back to the Marina Abramovich thing, you know, and a very vulnerabilizing context. But after a couple of days, they got used to it and they engaged in eye contact. But this is not just eye contact, right? There's obviously some interaction here as well that they could cue into. So they were looking face to face to each other, and then they turned to the lecture or the video and engage in their regular classroom activities. Now this setup allowed us to compare kids who were sitting next to each other and kids who were sitting not next to each other in the classroom, but also compare kids who were sitting next to each other who had engaged in eye contact before class and kids who were sitting next to each other who had not had this eye contact experience. So what we found is that those kids who sat next to each other and had eye contact showed more synchrony during class than either of the two groups. So this is not mere adjacency, this is like having a reset or something where you're connecting to each other and then doing your own thing that predicts synchrony later. And this ties in with some of the social psychology literature suggesting that having some sort of meeting, a moment of meeting, resonates with people for a while, but not too long, because here the kids obviously all know each other already, so you might not find this. You might not have expected to find this effect, but so these moments of connection actually last for a while. And perhaps most interesting in this context is that we found that only for that group that had engaged with each other face to face, there was a relationship between brain synchrony and social closeness. So again, these kids know each other. They have been in the same school for 10 years. So they don't have to interact with each other really to know how much they like each other or not. But apparently there's something about this interaction that revives, this social closeness. And so this is another question that we're now addressing in the laboratory. What's going on here? Is this is this a cued attention thing where you're sitting next to each other and then you're remaining attentive to each other? Or is it a resonance thing where you looked at each other, kind of like when you put a song in somebody else's head and they continue singing it, but they don't have to necessarily be in the same room for this to perpetuate. So taken together, we find that there is a number of factors that predict brain synchrony: class appreciation, teacher likability, focus, social closeness, group affinity, and personal distress. And so unless you're Marina Abramovich and you're satisfied with the telepathy style explanation where brainwaves flow through the air and they meet each other magically and synchronize, we would like to have some sort of overarching explanation as to why these different factors predict synchrony. And although it might not be specific enough to be exactly called a mechanism per se, we think that shared attention, at least in the classroom situation, is a likely candidate for such a overarching explanation. And then we resort to our training in neuroscience and language and find an explanation in entrainment, where there's a stimulus with a temporal structure, like me speaking or the video or something visual. And under low engagement and low shared attention conditions, people's brains don't entrain as much to the stimulus. And as a result, they also don't entrain with each other, and there's not so much synchrony between the students in this case. Now, under high engagement and high shared attention conditions, each student would be completely and perfectly entrained to the stimulus, and then also to each other. The reality of it is obviously that there's some students that are less engaged and some students that are higher engaged, and this is where the social factors and the focus factors and all of those things come into play and determine in a top-down fashion how much each student is entrained to the stimulus and how and this would predict variations in synchrony. Now, during dyadic face-to-face interactions, maybe it's a little bit more, this explanation would still hold, but there's obviously a little bit more of a complex situation going on because you're not just passively entraining to a stimulus, you're also engaging in joint action and coordination. So we went in, for the mutual wave machine, we went into a little bit more detail to try to understand where the synchrony comes from and how different levels of synchrony might interact with each other. And see if that gives some sort of explanation of like the joint action factor in predicting synchrony. So in all the plots that I showed you, it was a mix between the imaginary coherence metric and the projective power correlation metric that I briefly mentioned. And we looked at this over for each frequency and then extracted the frequency that was most, where there was a significant correlation. And then I showed you the scatter plots from those significance points before. And so now I'm showing you also the correlation between synchrony and behavior for each frequency ranging from 0 to 30. And what we're finding is that there's a peak at around 7 hertz, where synchrony at 7 hertz predicts a lot of things in terms of behavior, like social closeness and personal distress. And that the same is true for coherence at 20 hertz, where that predicts social closeness and focus, for example. And so if we look at the relationship between these lower and higher frequencies, we also see that the two are correlated. So for those pairs that show an increase in synchrony in the lower frequency at around 7-8 hertz, they also show higher synchrony at around 20 hertz. So those two co-modulate independent of behavior, right? So just taking like pairs and looking at these two frequencies and seeing if they go up together or down together in terms of synchrony. And so here we can come, there's a possible shared attention explanation that can apply here also. So if you think about one person, their attention throughout this 10-minute experience is not continuous, right? So your attention goes up in flows, maybe 6 seconds or so. You go up and down, you flow into attention, out of attention. And that's true for you guys right now as well. You're not gonna, I might want you to, but you're not paying attention to me continuously at the same level for 45 minutes straight. It's just not happening. So you flow in and out of attention, and other people in the room might flow in and out of attention at a different rate or at a different, in different moments, right? So maybe this slide, some of you are not really paying attention, and other slides, others were paying attention. So this would then not make you be in attentive moments at the same time. And so the hypothesis then is that if you are more attentive at the same time, this also allows you for more moments where you're in the same state, attentional state together, and it's actually those moments of meeting, so to speak. So if you're all paying attention right now to what I'm saying, then that also allows you to then create shared representations at these higher level frequencies. So there's some recent research suggesting and review papers suggesting that beta frequency specifically is indexes endogenous representation, activation, and creation. So here, the idea then is that you're in shared attentional states, and that allows you to create shared representations. And we found that some self-reported strategies relate to this. So people who have eye contact, where you're doing something together, together, they show higher synchrony, and people who engage in joint action show higher synchrony, but not people who decided to think about the same thing, because that doesn't give them any hooks to create those shared representations. So this fits a model that has been proposed many times in the past, where your like non-social stimuli, act as interaction independent synchronizers. So, for example, me talking for well, it's a social stimulus, but like watching a video, you have your own beliefs and expectations that feed into how you perceive this stimulus. And then if there's another person present, you have also the other person's beliefs and expectations that feed into this, and your own model of the beliefs and expectations of the other person. And that together, that calibration of the two creates a common ground. And you need some social stimulus, like some sort of hook in the world around you, to allow you to, navigate and calibrate this common ground. All right. So I now wanted to switch again to some, sorry, this is like a little bit of a hard switch. So for this kind of coordination, social coordination to occur, you also need intentionality. So now to study how these kinds of coordinations spontaneously emerge in groups, we're going back to the art context. I was like a quick anecdote, and I'll take like just a couple of minutes for this. This is my morning commute. I ride my bike across the Williamsburg Bridge every single morning, and it's a cacophony of honking because there's always traffic, and it's very annoying. So I arrive at work and I am depleted with the experience of all that like input and noise around me. But one morning I cross the bridge and I hear, there was a couple of FedEx trucks, and I hear ding, 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 and there's one truck that was starting this like honking, and another FedEx truck that was a little bit behind them did a response. Now this is a very primal, call and response thing that lots of animals do, and so we do it also, naturalistic. And if we see somebody that's in our species, like another FedEx truck, we respond. They do dun 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 dun. And then there was another truck that tried to like chime in and also tried to like do some sort of call and answer. And he was not a FedEx guy, so I was very, there was a lot of suspense to know whether or not they were actually going to respond to this. But it led me to think about, like what happens if you spontaneously put people in the same situation, and whether some sort of coordination emerges based on this audiovisual reflection that we've been doing now for years. So what we've created is based on the group synchrony, a neurofeedback situation or brain-computer situation that is basically the social network that is drawn in real time, as you can see on the left. Where people's brain synchrony reflects their position in the network, and it also reflects their hubness, so to speak. So here, this is the end. You see like a red dot. The red dot is clearly the hub in the situation, and the purple person is the outlier or the outcast. And then this is visualized in a top view situation where people are led through the space based on their synchrony, and they also get hints about whether they're the hub or not with liquid flows. So you walk through the space, and you get pulled into. Everybody gets pulled into you if you are the hub of the situation. And and everybody also has their own soundscape. And people play around with their own soundscape, and they play around with their own visuals. And we asked whether they create, their own conversation and common ground with this playful installation. Now, with the general public, the answer is no. So everybody loves playing with their own visualization and their own sonification. But as you can hear, it's still cacophonous. So people are not actually in tune to like by themselves and create a situation where they are like, okay, so now I'm going to give you space to like explore your own soundscape, to do the dan 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 dan, and then I'm going to respond, and then we're going to create a song together. So in our first test, it failed miserably. There was way too much going on, and people didn't really interact with each other. So we took a step back and started working with dancers, and specifically, so people who are used to moving to music, creating their own, like, to establishing their own body position in relation with others in their and joint action and common grounding. So we worked with a company called ICK Amsterdam, and they have been working with notions of synchrony for around a decade now. So it was very interesting and informative to try to work with them on creating a taxonomy of synchrony and joint action. So I started my presentation talking to you about synchrony as like some sort of overarching term, and I've like kind of glossed over what synchrony means. But obviously an open question as to whether different metrics of synchrony might correspond to different types of joint action. There's notions of synchronicity that we might all want to achieve. And then there's tools that lead us to this sense of connectedness. Are we doing something simultaneous or together? Is it play or solo, initiation or response? Then there's units. Are we synchronizing from the body to the body, the performer to the audience, the sound to the visual, our body to visuals or sounds, things that happen in our day-to-day all the time, and that in a dance or music context, we can crystallize and try to test. And then there's vehicles terms that we use in neuroscience all the time, anticipation or predictive coding, or resonance or shared entrainment, closeness or distance, contagion, tuning or feedback, shared attention. These are all concepts that go cross-disciplinary, and that you can then start taking back into your own practice to start asking to what extent each of these might map into neurometrics and get us closer to an understanding of how our brain supports these social constructs in a little bit more of a deeper fashion than just like we synchronize more when we coordinate, or we synchronize more when we attend, because that ultimately is not a detailed enough explanation of the phenomenon. And I'm going to close on this, where we did a performance that was a result of a 3-day collaborative workshop with the dancers in the Ballet National de Marseille. That was a double duet. You have two dancers, and they're dancing vignettes of the choreographers of their company. And we created a visualization and a sonification of both their movements and of their synchrony. So you're kind of creating a double, it's not so clear in this particular clip, but just like with the hubs, the flows come together. If they're more synchronized, then they grow apart if they're less synchronized. So it's their shadows, their minds that are synchronized, that are reflecting their mental synchrony in the background. And then we recorded EEG from the audience as well, in collaboration with Brain Products, who came to set up some much fancier EEG headsets than we used in the classroom, and to understand the perceptual process of an audience experience as well. So this is not data that we're analyzing, but it's really a pilot for a future study. So like we used a crowdsourcing neuroscience approach to try to bring research from the lab into the real world in a collaboration between science, art, and education. And even though we might not, live in that future that I showed with like reading brain, pumping information into the kids' brain, I hope I have shown you that we are to some extent ready for exploring, and I think that's what the theme is going to be of this whole workshop, of exploring how we can bring neuroscience into more naturalistic situations, and along the way have lots of fun and learn from the general public and from artists and from educators as well, to inform our own and better our own neuroscience practice. Thank you.
Susanna. I think we have time for at least a couple questions. Let's see if you can be heard from the audience. Yeah.
Okay.
Just try from here.
Can you hear that at all?
Is that audible or a little bit?
Okay, I'll repeat it. I'll repeat it.
Okay.
I'll try to.
Okay.
I'll try to make it concise. One question is how social of an explanation do we want for this, right? So I think in a lot of these cases, although these are group tasks, it's not clear that they're social tasks in the sense that they require social cognition for their success. The fact that people are doing things together doesn't imply that they're doing it by thinking about each other, and so it's not social. It's not a kind of social task in a richer sense. The distinction here that's maybe useful is joint versus shared attention, right? If you were paying attention to something and I'm paying attention to it, then we get a shared context. But that doesn't mean it's not the same thing as a shared attention where we're attending to the same thing. And one reason to think that what's going on in these cases, I'll keep it brief here. One reason to think that what's going on is not social is that Miguel Nicolillas has done these experiments with monkeys with implanted electrodes, and if they're controlling a cursor, 3 monkeys can control a cursor at the very same time, and they can solve a task just by synchronizing their brains, but it's very implausible that the cats who do this are actually doing it by social cognition. So in that case, you would have synchrony without sociality. So one question is, how social of an explanation do we need to get this going? I'm sorry, that's not very concise.
Okay, well, so
No, I mean, it's a great.
could you hear that? You ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so one thing I noticed as I'm going through, I need to change one of my slides that still says joint attention, because we are definitely talking about shared attention, and I don't know to what extent we can speak to joint attention. Obviously, some of our tasks are social, like the group discussions, where you have to coordinate and interact, and and in the mutual wave machine also the interactions are social. But we don't, I personally don't know that I need a strictly social explanation, how weird that might sound. I don't need to be a social Puritan because a lot of the things that we're trying to do is also test a laboratory model in the real world, right? So do these same kind of shared attention things hold in real world situation that we know from very controlled laboratory cocktail party effects, for example, those kinds of questions. If your question, I think, becomes more pertinent and perhaps possibly problematic in cases where people, for example, compare collaboration and competition in cases where and find that there's more synchrony in a collaborative context, even if they're not in the same room. And then you can ask questions about whether this is also pure, the explanation itself there even can be purely social. But I'm not. I want to kind of remain agnostic in that sense about that. I know it's not a super satisfactory answer, but I think it's a very great and valid question. But yeah, does that sort of make sense in terms of an answer?
I was just inviting speculation. I think it's a wide open question.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So I think, what I think is very interesting, I might have tried to highlight is puzzling and interesting is just the mere social presence effects that you may get, and what that might mean. So there are some studies suggesting that and also the measures that we use, like personal distress or interpersonal reactivity, that are supposed to measure social interactivity, as they're called that. But then we get this effect of shared attention, which raises questions about whether these are really social, right? So so we're now in a laboratory testing how deep you can go, basically, and using for low-level psychophysics experiments whether these social traits actually predict people's responses to oddballs, for example, which are arguably non-social. But if they do, then you can raise the question of what you're actually measuring. Are you measuring a social thing, or are you measuring something that is about low-level perception, or are you if you're a more social person, does that affect your low-level perception?
Okay, so yeah, I think we maybe one more question. Suzanne has been kind enough to say she'll join us again for our small group discussions at the end of the day, so we'll have more chances there. But to stay on schedule, maybe one more question.
In your experiments, have you looked at the temporal relationship of synchronization to behavior? I'm curious if synchronization is a cause of some more like perceptual synchronization, or is a predictor, as to say something that's driving behavioral or effective synchronization.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have up to now, like all the data that I've shown you are averages across like a couple of minutes of experience, right? So first half, second half, or the entire video average synchrony. But those are really, look, one for like the mutual wave machine, like we don't have any kind of we don't know what's going on, and also if we had video, I don't know how we would analyze thousands of video feeds. But like one thing there is that I was like thinking, well, maybe we can look at motion points and see if that happens right before or after a synchronizing activity, because the prediction would be that if you have some sort of joint action, which obviously should be measurable in increased motion artifacts, that would increase synchrony after. We did also look between people at Granger causality to see if like one person might predict the other, but then there was no interpretable findings there. But obviously you're very right. Like you should have specific moments in time that either synchronize or maybe synchrony predicts specific events, behavioral events after. That's a very
Well, thank you very much.